My name is Tony DelGiorno, and I am a lifelong resident of Springfield and running for the 99th House Seat District. I am a Democrat, and I am currently a county board member and have 4 years, just about 4 years of experience on the county board now, having won an election both in 2012 and 2014. I am someone who remembers where they came from, and what that means is I grew up in a 3-room house over by Bunn Park here in town, and my mom had worked for Secretary of State at the time I was born and as a typist, and had decided that since she wasn't sure she could even have children, that she would stay home alone, or not alone, stay home with me and give up her job. And that was back in a time when you could be a stay-at-home mom. Our economy doesn't allow that these days. My dad was selling insurance and got caught up in the early 80s recession, lost his job, and we had to rely on public assistance at times. I remember standing in line at the Woodside Township offices for government cheese and powdered milk. But Dad did what he could, got a job driving a cab, and we tried to make ends meet as best we could. And eventually I went to Little Flower and Ursuline Academy here in town. My parents volunteered so that they could work off the tuition costs at Little Flower, and I got a job working for the nuns to put myself through Ursuline. And through MAP grants, scholarships, and hard work, I put myself through Illinois College and have a political science, history, and international studies degree, and eventually went to law school and have the student loans to prove it, like many families do. And my parents being older, my mom had been ill after I graduated law school and needed to have in-home care assistance through the community care program. And after her death, my dad had already been diagnosed with early onset dementia, and because of needing to find care for him and figure out what the best approach was, I decided to actually develop an elder law practice. And so for the last 13 years, I've devoted my professional career with the same firm, helping seniors with everything from elder abuse and neglect cases to Medicaid and nursing home issues and general estate planning. And the reason that I got into this race was because of the attack that we have seen on the middle class and working families by this governor. And my opponent, having been an employee of the governor as the First Lady's chief of staff, has voted with him against the interests of our district. And I feel that a state that wishes to balance its budgets on the back of our most vulnerable is not a state that we should have. It's not a state that we should deserve. And that is why I put myself forward to be a candidate this year, so that we would have independent-minded representation here in the 99th District that stands up for those that need it most.
Let's go ahead and talk about, you mentioned balancing the budget and how you feel it should not be done. Illinois is obviously in the midst of a serious fiscal crisis. How should we approach getting the budget balanced?
Absolutely. The approach that I think we need to take is a mixed approach. First off, we need to look at how our government operates, how it runs, and where we can, we should look for those efficiencies that are optimal. I was a proponent of the Citizens Efficiency Commission reauthorization while on the county board, and served on the special committee to get it reauthorized and put before the voters. I think it's very important to look at programs and reassess them from time to time. However, we cannot take a wholesale approach that just uses a hatchet to chop up government budgets. Instead, we have to use a more methodical, scalpel type approach. Otherwise, we are going to have programs and real people suffering if we make cuts too drastically, too quickly, without knowing how we get from point A to point B. Secondly, and even the governor has acknowledged this, is we need to look at new sources of revenue. First off, Illinois overwhelmingly passed the millionaire surcharge of 3%, which would tax incomes of $1 million or more. That would be dedicated to schools. That was only an advisory referendum in 2014, and unfortunately my opponent voted against actually putting that on the ballot for 2016 as a binding referendum that would change the Constitution to allow for it. That's real money that could have been generated for our school districts. Secondly, I believe that we need to look at converting our state from the arcane flat tax system to a fair graduated tax system. There was a study done by the Illinois Economic Policy Institute that examined the state income tax rates of our neighboring states. We looked to see what our neighbors in the Midwest have done to see how we might be able to best use that here in Illinois. And one example is if we adopted the tax rates of the state of Iowa, we would be able to wipe away our current budget deficit, including the pension payments that is part of the budget. So I think that we need to take a serious look at that approach. And that was another vote that was taken this spring in the House, for which my opponents opposed. It would have generated, it would have allowed us to generate the revenue to get out of this crisis.
So on the expense side, you mentioned scalpel approach versus hatchet. Give us examples of what your scalpel approaches would be.
Well, to name specific line items, I'm not prepared to do that because I think it takes an adult approach to not systematically say this program needs to go. I think not every program potentially has value, but we need to find the value in those programs. And there was a push at one point in time to have a mechanism in state government that would actually review what the programs did, and I don't know that it ever went anywhere. I believe that was started 2 administrations ago. Unfortunately, it never came of, nothing ever came of it. What we need to do as a state, if Governor Rauner is serious about reforming government, is he needs to actually do a top-to-bottom review. As the head of the executive agencies, he has the authority to do that. I don't even think he needs legislative authority to do that. But he needs to do it not in a vacuum, he needs to do it with the stakeholders that are at the table. Every bureaucracy, including Illinois government, has certain purviews that are important to provide services to the people of the state of Illinois. And if the governor is serious about providing taxpayer value, then he should be looking at them line by line as opposed to making wholesale attacks.
So on the budget stalemate.
Yes.
Obviously, been going on for a while.
Mm-hmm.
Gotten worse. Who holds the bulk of the responsibility for where we're at right now?
That's a very good question, and quite frankly, in my opinion, it's like 2 kids fighting in a sandbox. It comes down to the governor and the speaker not being able to get past whatever personal animosities that they have. If the governor was serious about governing instead of playing political hardball, when that first budget was passed, which I believe all accounts say that it was about $4 billion out of balance, that was the fiscal year 2016 budget. If the governor was serious about governing, he would have looked at that budget and used his constitutional line item veto authority to get rid of that $4 billion. And then would have said, Speaker Madigan, President Cullerton, here's what I'm not willing to pay for until we talk about my reforms and how we get the revenue to pay for these extra programs. But then at least the basic operations of government could have continued, bills could have been paid, the state wouldn't be accruing interest on these unpaid backlogged bills. Instead, he decided to play hardball, and the people of the state of Illinois suffered because of it. Speaker Madigan, on the other side, needs to be willing to negotiate. However, I believe that when it comes to basic principles of protecting wages for middle-income families and making sure that those that are injured on the job have a fair shake at getting compensated for injuries on the job, and a host of other aspects of the governor's turnaround agenda that directly affect middle-class families, I think Speaker Madigan is absolutely right to say, no, we're not going to consider this. If I were Speaker, I certainly wouldn't consider that, because to me, the only way to grow the economy in the state of Illinois or anywhere in this country is you have to have a hard, solid core. Someone, now I'm the last one to say go to the gym, but if you go to the gym, look at me. If you go to the gym, what do they want you to do? They want you to work on your core. The middle class is our core in this society. And if we don't help the middle class, and if we don't make sure that they have a fair shake in our economy, then we are going to rot around the edges. And that is the priority I have in any budget that I would vote on.
Are there any aspects of the governor's turnaround agenda that you'd be willing to look at? Could you just
Yes.
walk us through what your
Absolutely.
non-starter versus
Absolutely.
willing to look at?
I actually am a proponent of the Independent Map Initiative. I believe that when President Obama came here in February and spoke to the General Assembly and stated that it was only right to have independent or bipartisan commissions draw the lines, the president has called upon that because there are states that are controlled by Republicans that do the same thing to Democrats. And I think it's disingenuous for us, being in a quote-unquote blue state, to have Democrats do it in the reverse. I would note, however, that the last time that the Republican Party did control remapping, back in the 90s, I believe, the Democrats lost control of both chambers, but only for a 2-year period. So the state may be more Democratic than what the governor's willing to admit in that regard. But that being said, the basic principle that the voters should choose their representatives and not the representatives choosing their voters, I believe is absolutely accurate. Second, while I'm not a fan of term limits, because I think the ultimate decision of who represents the constituents or the voters of any district should be the voters. I have concerns with arbitrary lines that were not in an original constitution, but be it our federal constitution or even our state constitution. I feel that it's a knee-jerk reaction to those that have been in positions of power for a long time. What I do strongly support is term limits for leadership, which can be taken care of by a change of the rules. I believe that having leadership that's in power for too long is a detriment to our ability to seek good policy in this state. I believe that if there had been term limits, we might be on our 5th or 6th speaker at this point in time, compared to when Speaker Madigan first began. And I would note I was only 5 when he first became speaker. So I acknowledge it's been a long time. But to say that only Speaker Madigan could stand up to an agenda that hurts working class families like the turnaround agenda does, in my opinion, I think gives little credit to other potential Democrats that could have come up in the ranks. So I am an advocate for term limits for leadership. Another proposal that the governor has put forward is consolidation of local governments or streamlining local governments. It is true that the state of Illinois has, I believe it's the 2nd largest number of units of local government in the country. Here in Sangamon County, we have over 25 townships, and townships were created back in a time when you needed to be able to travel by horse and buggy to get somewhere to get what business done with the government you needed to get done. And times have changed. While I respect a lot of what our townships do, for instance, here in Capital Township, which is almost coterminous with the city of Springfield, I think that Capital Township and the city of Springfield should be consolidated. The governor signed legislation that specifically allowed Belleville Township and the city of Belleville in St. Clair County to do that just this last year. And I think we could do the same thing here in Springfield. I believe that there should be opportunities and changes to state law that would allow for the consolidation of these districts and local government units. Because what that means is that's another line item on your property taxes. Could that be done more efficiently? Therefore, you're not paying another board, another attorney. And I'm an attorney, so yes, I'm saying take away the business. All of these things that each different unit of government has to pay for, if they're consolidated, that means they can consolidate their overhead.
So one of the other items on the governor's turnaround agenda is property tax freeze.
Yes.
Can you talk to that some?
Yes, absolutely. I think that the only way that we really get to real property tax relief is if the state of Illinois abides by its constitutional obligation to be the primary source of education funding. In the 99th district, depending on where you live, you could see where your property taxes, either 52% of your property tax goes to your school district all the way up to 66% of your property tax bill. And the reason that so much of our property taxes goes toward the school district is because the state has failed in its obligations to make sure that there is adequate funding. And when the state keeps pushing that burden off on the local school district of here's your mandate and you've got to pay for it, or we're not going to pay for this, and if you want to keep this program, you've got to come up with the money for it, what does that mean? The property taxes go up. So for the governor to simply call for a property tax freeze means that that would freeze our ability for school districts to have what funding they are able to put together with property taxes to make sure that our students and our children are properly educated. So I think if we want to talk about property tax relief, we need to talk about what the source of property taxes is in the first place.
So part of that freeze also, in order to help county, or help local units of government, was to empower local boards to change the way they bargain collectively. Any thoughts about that?
I think that right to work is a red herring because the governor and many of his persuasion, such as Scott Walker in Wisconsin, are of the opinion that all costs in government can be traced back to the fact that there is collective bargaining and a prevailing wage. And what the prevailing wage does is it ensures that there is a base wage for which a fair day's work is fairly compensated with a fair day's pay. And that becomes the benchmark by which other employment opportunities are compensated. And if we drive down the cost of labor, that means that the market will also drive down wages. And when we have costs in our society that continue to go up, luckily we've seen gas actually go down in the last few years, but as costs continue to rise, wages have been stagnant. And so people are having problems making ends meet. That's what happens when you have an economy that is slowly recovering from the Great Recession of 2008 and 2009. So in my opinion, I believe that we need to protect collective bargaining. We need to maintain the prevailing wage.
Just as kind of an aside, have you seen any studies or anything that would address the impact of changing the prevailing wage?
I have, but I couldn't cite them for you at this moment.
What about in Sangamon County with, from the county board perspective?
County board has always been really good at adopting the prevailing wage and actually hasn't hasn't examined that as a potential cost-saving measure. In fact, the Republican leadership here in Sangamon County did not introduce the right-to-work zone resolution that the governor was pushing in other parts of the state early in his term. And I believe that's because the leadership here in Sangamon County, and yes, the Republican leadership here in Sangamon County, has developed a good working relationship with organized labor here in the area.
Can we pursue a little more deeply the whole thing about school funding?
Yes.
And especially some of the school funding formula refund or reform matters that are kind of out there.
Sure.
What's your sense of all of that?
Sure. I believe that what Senator Andy Minar has been doing in spearheading this discussion and bringing it to the forefront of public policy is actually a very good service for the people of the state of Illinois. I'm frustrated by the fact that we are yet again doing another commission to study it when I think it's been studied several times. The reality is, and in my opinion, the way that it affects the 99th District is I'm afraid that Senator Minar's approach, while going to great lengths to try to get extra money to districts that do not have a high property tax base, and also have a higher incidence of a poverty rating in their district. I applaud him for trying to get extra funds to those districts. What I am concerned about is we end up having losers, because even though he has discussed a hold harmless provision that would keep funding at the same levels for a few years as we gradually move over to the new system he's proposing, ultimately there are school districts here in the 99th District that would potentially lose out. And so what I believe we should do is first hold firm on where we are with current funding, and then add a poverty index rating to accomplish what Senator Minar is proposing. There are poorer districts that, like I said, don't have the ability to, or don't have the tax assessment base to fund their districts. There are also, having been a child that relied on public assistance, I know what the struggles of those families are. You know, it's hard to tell that I ever went hungry. I didn't. I was lucky in that regard. But there are children that go to school hungry. There have been instances, you know, there are programs now in place to allow for a school breakfast program. We don't know what a lot of these children may be dealing with at home. You know, be it because they have just one parent, or that one parent has to get multiple jobs to try to keep the lights on. They struggle, and so I know that that's an extra burden on that child when they go to school thinking about what's going on at home. And so they need those extra resources in the classroom. We need to have teacher training to help them. Our teachers are too often used as scapegoats for benchmarks that have been artificially put in place for our school system. There are a lot of times we need to think about what's going on at home and what's going on in the community, and provide the resources to the school and to the teachers to assist that student so that they have that level playing field when they get to school. So in that regard, I truly believe that shifting money around isn't the answer, but ensuring that the state is fully funding education the way it's supposed to, pursuant to the Constitution that says the state shall be the primary source of funding. What does primary source mean? Does it mean 51% or does it mean more? And so I believe that...
And it's currently at what, 33?
Yes.
And as for paying for it?
I would go back to the millionaire's tax that was overwhelmingly approved statewide and in Sangamon County. In Sangamon County, I believe it was in the mid-60s for approval when the voters went to the ballot box in 2014. It's a popular provision. And for those that would say that would drive millionaires out of the state or people would stop wanting to be millionaires, I've never known anyone that doesn't want to be a millionaire. And I think if they had to pay 3% extra on the first dollar over that $1 million mark, I think they'd be happy just to say that they're a millionaire. And quite frankly, there is an example in the state of Minnesota where Governor Dayton changed tax rates and asked for our wealthiest to pay a little bit more, and he increased the minimum wage at the same time, and Minnesota is viewed as one of the strongest economies in the Midwest right now. So helping working families and building that middle class and making it the strong core that it needs to be for our economic society, that's what I go back to.
One of the big areas of disagreement with you and your opponent has been the issue of the AFSCME contract, the governor's
Yes.
role, the bargaining. Can you talk about why you differ from her on that issue?
Absolutely. My opponent, Ms. Jimenez, voted against House Bill 580, which would have required the state of Illinois and AFSCME to go to binding arbitration to hammer out the terms of the state contract. We have been without a contract for over a year now. And in my opinion, federal arbitration has been successfully used in other instances. The postal workers, for one, have gone to arbitration. And the goal of arbitration is not for one side to win over the other. The goal is for the arbitrator to say, what's the best you can do, employer, and what's the best you can do, employee, and then they make a decision somewhere in the middle. And that would create certainty. It would ensure that our services in this state continue to be provided to the people of the state of Illinois. And my opponent voted against that not once, not twice, but 3 times in the 2 veto override votes that were taken. And then she went so far as to sign on to a letter with, I believe it was 6 other Republican colleagues of hers, asking the governor and AFSCME to return to the bargaining table. And to me, that was a disingenuous gimmick on the part of all of them to say, we want you to come back to the table when it is crystal clear that the governor has no intention of going back to the table. He's been wanting an impasse to be declared since January. And if the governor gets his final proposal imposed upon state employees, as I understand it, an average family of 4 would have to pay an extra $500 per month in health insurance premiums. And the governor is also proposing to put everybody into a bronze plan under the Affordable Care Act, which dictates a 40% deductible is paid by the employee. Imagine what that does to your family budget if you have to start paying an extra $500 in premiums, and if something catastrophic happens or whatever medical bill, you've got to pay 40% of it. And what that means for our local economy, with state employees being the largest sector of our economy, followed by the medical district, which is also heavily reliant on state employees and receiving payments from the state under the state insurance program. Imagine what happens when that $500 a month extra is taken out of the local economy. People aren't going to local restaurants. People aren't buying a car. People aren't doing a whole host of things, and that will end up having a ripple effect that will bring down the Sangamon County and surrounding area economy. And that's why I think it's so vital to get a fair contract in place that doesn't so dramatically shift costs to the employees and to the state workers in this area that it has an immediate negative consequence for our economy.
The governor has said that the contract could end up costing the state an extra $3 billion a year. Do you think that figure is correct?
I haven't seen the data that he's relying upon to get to that $3 billion figure. What I believe that most of the unions have agreed to at this point in time is not to touch health insurance benefits, but to have a wage freeze. And AFSCME, I think, has gone so far as to say that they would be willing to have that discussion also. But for whatever reason, the governor's not willing to have that discussion. And I don't know why. So where he comes up with his figures, I don't know. I think it's interesting to see how the legislative review of the stopgap budget, for instance, if we're going to talk numbers, showed that it was going to be, the stopgap budget was going to be about $9 billion out of balance. And the governor comes back with his own numbers saying, oh no, it's only going to be about $6 billion out of balance. When in reality, the original budget that he vetoed over a year ago and started this whole nightmare was $4 billion out of balance. So the more Governor Rauner has interjected himself into this process and brought the economy of Illinois down, brought state services down, brought services for our children, our elderly, and our disabled down, the more he's done that, the more he's actually racking up the bill. And I think it's time that stops.
One last question on the
Sure.
contract issue. The other argument that's been raised is, should the state with its financial problems be putting a potential cost in the hands of an arbiter as opposed to someone who's elected to office?
Like I said before, I think that having an arbiter that is fair and impartial and is not pushing a political agenda is more important than having someone who is elected and pushing an agenda that is harmful to not only state employees but to working families and middle-class families around this state. And AFSCME has asked to be able to go back to the bargaining table with the governor, and he's not interested. And so for anyone to say that that decision should be in the governor's hands, he's actually made his decision. He doesn't care anymore. He doesn't care about middle-class families and state employees in our area. He wants an impasse declared, and he wants to impose his terms. And whenever you have, in basic labor negotiations, management and employees that can't come together, you have to go to a third party. And I fully support that third party be an arbitrator that could bring this whole problem to an end and quickly.
Pensions are a large portion of the budget, and also the amount funded is quite large. How do we address that, both for current employees, future?
Sure. You're absolutely right. What we have been doing with pensions in this state is treating it like a credit card. For over 30 years, we have used it to fund other basic programs and services that the state provides, because nobody in state government had the intestinal fortitude to look at new revenues when it was necessary. Instead, they kicked the can down the road. And so what I'm proposing is, with the pension and with the money that's been borrowed, I believe we need to get it put back into the pension system. The way I would do that is we should issue pension obligation bonds. Those bonds would immediately put that money back into the system that has been borrowed for the last 30 years and allows us to refinance that debt. Then, if we converted ourselves, for instance, to the fair graduated tax or found other sources of revenue, that should be dedicated to paying down that debt. And any money left after that, going to the schools. What I see as the biggest problem for the state with this pension obligation is much like what any family would see. If you've overused your credit card and you can no longer make the minimum payments, what do you do as a family? You either file for bankruptcy. Well, the state of Illinois can't go through bankruptcy as much as the governor may like us to. Second, you refinance your debt and try to bring down the interest on it and make the payments manageable. 3, you cut elsewhere. So you give up cable, you give up, don't hold this against me, your subscription to the newspaper. You cut the extras that you can absolutely live without. And then finally, someone takes a second job to pay the bills. That's a new source of revenue. We have to do that at the state level. And I've already discussed a little bit about how we need to approach cuts. Just like with your family budget, is there anything that you could just say, I can get rid of wholesale? What if you were just told, I need to get rid of 20% across the board? Could you do that? Or do you need to go through your family's budget bit by bit, line by line, and decide what can I absolutely do without? And that's the approach I believe we need to take when it comes to putting the money back that we have been spending from our pension fund.
You talked some about, your belief that the middle class needs to be strong. What are some of the other steps the state needs to take to energize the economy in terms of attracting businesses?
Sure. The first thing with attracting businesses, obviously, is we need to have a budget that is stable, because businesses that are interested in moving and potentially moving to the state of Illinois want that stability. The second thing is I am actually a proponent of examining a program out of the state of New York called Startup New York. It's only a couple of years old, so the data on it is fairly new in that regard, and there's not much of it. But the concept is for new businesses starting up, or businesses that want to move into the state, or businesses that want to even expand, as long as they partner with a college or university to create their products or their services, they would have a 10-year no tax period. So that would be no income taxes for the business. Their fees are waived. There are a lot of startup fees that go along with creating a business or getting licensed in the state of Illinois. It's very much like a TIF district situation where you invest in that business so that it will create jobs and help areas that are that need to be empowered with new either manufacturing or services or what have you. So I'm a proponent of a concept like that. Another conversation I had with the Manufacturers Association is one of the tax policies that the state of Illinois has allowed to sunset or expire is a research and development tax deduction. What that means is manufacturers who are trying to improve their product or create a new product to put into the marketplace, here in the state of Illinois, they are no longer able to actually deduct that as a business cost. We can deduct it on the federal level. I prepare a handful of taxes every year as part of my law practice, and research and development costs can typically be deducted. Here in Illinois, because again, we didn't have the guts to vote for a permanent provision, means we don't have the stability of having that research and development as part of our state tax policy. And so manufacturers, when they find out that that's not on the table here in Illinois, they move on to the next one, to the next state. I think tax policies like that help a state or make that as an incentive for the manufacturer or the business to want to move to Illinois are very important. Lastly, and most importantly in my opinion, is the state of Illinois needs to fully fund education. And that includes higher education. Twice, my opponent, Ms. Jimenez, has voted against during the spring session, voted against funding for higher education, including MAP grant funding for middle-class students to be able to afford a college education. And that affects our district right here. We've got both UIS and Lincoln Land Community College here in the 99th District. And the reason that I say education is so important to attract business is if we're business friendly, why, if you want to be business friendly, why would you as a business want to move to a state that doesn't have world-class schools and a world-class higher education system from which you would want to hire, and a system in which you would be proud to have your employees educate their own children? We don't have that right now. In the last year with higher education, we have seen students flee this state because of the funding crisis. We have seen a brain drain with our professors who have sought employment elsewhere. I know, for instance, my wife is a college professor over at Illinois College in Jacksonville. And Illinois College has attempted and has gone so far as to try to eat the $2 million in MAP grant funding that they would have received as assistance for middle-income students. And the way that they ended up making the cuts to absorb that included cutting retirement benefits for employees, including the professors. It included a wage freeze for everybody. It included consolidating programs. And it's now led to a wholesale a review of educational programming and what programs and departments are most necessary and are flourishing. And so everyone has been affected, even our private institutions. And so what has happened in the last year and a half has been disastrous for our education system. And for a company outside of the state of Illinois to want to move here when we aren't training enough engineers to replace the engineers that are retiring, for example, means that we are not building an economy that is ready to host a new company that wants to start up or move to the state of Illinois.
So what are you hearing out as you campaign?
People are sick and tired of it. They're tired of the negativity. They're tired of the budget impasse. They lay the blame at the governor and at Speaker Madigan. They're wanting fresh blood in there, and they're wanting someone who's not beholden to somebody for the position that they have. I've even been asked, there was a recent mailer that came out about from the Illinois Republican Party calling me a Madigan puppet. And seeing as how I've only met the man, I think, 2 or 3 times in passing at a reception here or there and had to tell him my name each time, I don't think that my relationship with Madigan rises to the level of being a puppet. And so people are quite pleased with the fact that I am more independent-minded and have been free to speak my mind and even buck my own party as I've done before.
If you were elected, you mentioned earlier you think it's not good to have leaders in power for too long. If you were elected, would you support Speaker Madigan to remain Speaker?
The problem is that while Speaker Madigan has been there a long time, the alternative is someone who is pushing Rauner's agenda. And I don't agree with that. Do I think it's time for new leadership in our legislature? Absolutely. Would I welcome an alternative that would not vote for and support Rauner's agenda and not be Speaker Madigan? I would certainly be open to that.
Right. Well, if the Democrats continue to control the
Right.
chamber, would you support a Democrat other than Speaker Madigan for Speaker?
If there was a Democratic alternative, yes. And I would like to point out the last time that we had a downstate Speaker of the House was in 1959. And I think it is important that legislative leadership be reflective of our entire state. I'm not bad-mouthing Chicago in that regard. My dad grew up in Chicago, the son of Italian immigrants during the Depression. The city holds a place in my heart because of that. It's part of our state. I don't want it to leave the state of Illinois, as some would say. But we have to be mindful that Chicago is not all of Illinois. And I think it's high time that we had someone from downstate be part of leadership. And as I've told people on the doors, if you want to ensure that the priorities and the values of downstate Illinois are represented at the table in the Illinois House of Representatives, having a downstate Democrat there is the best way to accomplish that. Because at least in our current political climate, a downstate Democrat's going to have a better opportunity to voice their opinions than a downstate Republican will.